This morning we are continuing to walk through our journey in exploring the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to read from Mark chapter 4. This is Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. It's a story about a storm, and perhaps some of you find yourselves in a storm this morning. Mark 4:35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased. There was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This is God's word in Mark chapter 4. Before the storm hit, there may have been a sense of excitement with the disciples. Jesus said, "Let's go across to the other side." And maybe there was this, we're on a great adventure. This weekend, we, as a family, this may come as a surprise, we watched another children's film. And there's this great quote from Mary Poppins in Mary Poppins Returns. She says, right before they're about to go on this big adventure, she says to the kids who are asking all these questions, she says, "We're on the brink of an adventure, children. Don't spoil it with questions." And I think for us, as we're participating in an online worship service in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of an adventure, and we've got lots and lots of questions. Lots of questions. What's going on? Where are we going? And I think it's okay to ask those questions. I agree in some ways with Mary Poppins, but also maybe disagree in the sense, like, we can ask questions. This may not be an adventure that we have chosen. And we're in the middle of a storm. This is an adventure that maybe is feeling more like a scary storm that we don't really like, and maybe it feels similar to how those disciples felt. The wind and the waves may overtake us at times. But there's another song in that Mary Poppins Returns movie that I think is good for us to consider, because we're going through the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And there's this other song I say, "The cover is not the book, so open it up and take a look, because under the covers one discovers." And we are trying to open the covers of the Gospel of Mark. And I think when we do that, we really discover a powerful narrative explaining who God is through Jesus, through the understanding of who Jesus is. And this is what the early church did with the Gospel of Mark. This is what they did. The Gospel of Mark was written probably around 70 AD. And so it was explored back then. People discovered who Jesus was as they opened the cover. And this is what we continue to do today. And I think it's important to know that the Mark's Gospel makes it clear that Jesus' identity is mysterious to all. And that's a thing that I think we can celebrate. If you're sitting here this morning and you're not sure of who Jesus is, or you're not, you have questions and you're not sure about your understanding of who Jesus might be. Is he a prophet? Is he a teacher? Is he this historical figure? Did he even exist? There are good questions that we can ask about Jesus, and it's I love Mark's Gospel because it invites the reader into this journey of mystery of who Jesus is, because it's the way the gospel is written. There's really only kind of like three categories of people that understand who Jesus is. There's God, right? Jesus himself. The reader, right? We're sort of told at the beginning who Jesus is, and then there's also in Mark chapter 1, there's an unclean spirit, right? There's this sort of spiritual force of the other side of evil, right? Who knows who Jesus is. He says, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And so the reader, we are put in this position where we're kind of this neutral party in between God and this unclean spirit, where we are meant to read and encounter the Gospel of Mark, and at the end of it, answer that question that Jesus asks in Mark 8: "Who do you say that I am?" Right? Who do you say that I am? The genre is this narrative Christology. It's storytelling to help us see how God has made himself known through Jesus. How Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so in the first three chapters of Mark, it's this like wide sweeping, like action packed Jesus healing people. Jesus, gets on the scene and starts calling disciples, healing people. And it's this really powerful clashes with religious authorities. And it's just this action packed kind of gospel. And then in Mark 4, it slows down a bit for some extended moments of teaching. And Jesus tells some parables. And it's helpful to know that the disciples, as he's starting to teach a little bit, they continue to misunderstand who Jesus is. There's sort of like maybe this frustration from the reader of, man, the disciples just aren't getting it. And finally, again, in Mark 8, Peter has this moment where he finally gets it. He starts to understand who Jesus is. He says, "Yeah, you're the Holy One. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah." And Peter and Jesus tells Peter, he's like, "Yeah, good job. You got it." And then when Jesus starts to explain what that means, what that looks like, and he starts to talk about suffering, he starts to talk about the cross. That's when Peter says, "No, Jesus, I'm sorry. You must be mistaken." And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? So that it's this story of the disciples kind of getting it sometimes, but then not getting it, and at the end, the reader is brought back to this question in Mark 8, where Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" But who do you say that I am? And at the end, it's this question as we read along and we see the disciples getting it wrong, and we're this sort of neutral third party where God knows who God is and Jesus knows who Jesus is, but and this unclean spirit also acknowledge who he is. And the reader is in this like middle ground where we're encountering the story of who God is. And Jesus asks us that question: "Who do you say that I am?" So the story of calming the storm in Mark chapter 4, I think is important one. It's an important one for us to think about. And I think it has a lot for us in the middle of a pandemic. A couple of things just to be aware of that you might find interesting. There's this story references Jonah, the story of the prophet Jonah. In some really cool and exciting ways. I don't have time to go into all the details, but there's some really interesting acknowledgments and nods to the story of Jonah. And in short, it's this recognition that Jesus is the continuation and the fulfillment of the story of God's people, Israel. That Jesus, where Jonah was on the boat and there was a storm and Jonah said, "Well, you got to throw me over to save to get the storm to stop." And sure enough, they do, and the storm stops. But here, Jesus is asleep on the boat, and he says, and he himself says, "Peace, be still." Right. So this acknowledgement that Jesus, there's this foreshadowing with Jesus in the sign of Jonah and being in a tomb for 3 days and rising. There's this acknowledgement that Jesus has the power and authority himself to calm the storm, right? As God. So there's powerful things being said here about who Jesus is. And then also I think many have looked at this story and acknowledged that the boat is representative, symbolic of the church, of God's people. The term nave, which is sort of when churches back so long ago, when people would meet in church buildings, a nave was kind of like the center part of a church, and that comes from the Latin term referring to a ship, right? This idea that the church, even when gathered in a certain place, a setting, a building, that church itself is on mission. It's moving. On mission with God, and we as a church are all in this boat together with Jesus, right? As Jesus is the one that says, "Get in, we're going to the other side." That's in so many ways what the church is. It's this group of people who are in, and we're on movement. We're moving on mission with Jesus. And as we look at this story, he says, "Get in, we're going to the other side," and we get in, we go to the other side, and there's a storm. And so I think there were 5 things that kind of stood out, 5 reflections, if you will, on storms with Jesus, from Mark chapter 4. So starting with verse 37, a great windstorm arose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. The first thing is this, first reflection: being on mission with Jesus is not absent of storms. Being on mission with Jesus is not absent of storms. If someone says, become a Christian, acknowledge Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and your life will be perfect and absent of any kind of hardship, number one, they're lying to you, or number 2, they're trying to sell something to you, or number 3, perhaps all of those. Being on mission, being a follower of Jesus, is not to live a life absent of storms. And we're in the middle of a storm right now. A global pandemic has brought us to a place where our collective human brokenness is exposed. It's interesting how this pandemic is just, it's not creating pockets and expressions of injustice. It's simply exposing them. It's highlighting them in a way that is more, brings a broader awareness. They're not creating these issues. It's just exposing these issues. If you look at the way that the COVID is experienced in harsher ways by ethnic minorities than it is among white populations, right? This is just COVID. It's like it's highlighting and exposing the ways that our world continues to operate within systems of injustice, right? So Chicago, for example, take one city. African Americans make up 14.6% of the population, right? So 14.6% of the population African Americans in Chicago. And yet 52% of the COVID patients are African American, right? And 67% of the deaths are African American. And the factors that contribute to that, there's comorbidities, right? This idea of simultaneous chronic diseases that lead to an increased risk of health, right? And things like hypertension and diabetes, diseases, conditions that really are in many ways attributed to the lack of access to good, healthy foods. There's food deserts in the middle of a city, lack of access to good healthcare. There's factors like densely populated living conditions, that there's no opportunity to socially distance when you're so packed in tight with one another. There's a lack of access to good healthcare, so there's lower rates of testing, and so there's a lack of ability to access a good understanding of how the disease is moving throughout a densely populated area that doesn't have good access to healthcare. For many, there's an inability to work from home. 19.7% of African Americans can work from home, as opposed to 29.9% of white employees. Many ethnic minorities make up the essential workforce. Things like transportation and food services that are required to work right now, but oftentimes some of those positions, some of those careers don't have healthcare provided, right? So imagine being an essential worker being required to work in the middle of a pandemic when you don't have access to good healthcare. We have farm workers in our backyard. We have farm workers who are literally out there feeding our entire country. They have to each other. And right now, the rate of COVID is substantially greater in our own county, experienced in with our farm workers who are at work, essentially at work, because we all need to eat, and yet they're the ones experiencing the major outbreak in our midst, right? And this is not, COVID is not creating injustice. COVID is simply exposing it. And so our world, our church, everyone right now is going through this storm. Being on mission with Jesus is not absent of storms. Second, verse 38, Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" The second thing is, I think sometimes it seems like the storms will overtake the church. We're not new in thinking that this is a challenge that may overtake the church in some ways. From its inception, the church has dealt with Roman persecution. Try that one. But then as the years progressed, right, there were many in the church that against the church somehow, that was threatening the church. There's the theory of evolution that people continue somehow to think that somehow dismisses the truth of God. There's the secularization of society. There's the culture wars, pandemics. Let's stop and consider this. This is not the first pandemic the church has encountered. It's not. There have been pandemics before this, and yet Christ's church endures. Christ's body endures, just like the boat in the storm. It seems like sometimes the waves will overtake and the wind will cause that boat to perish, and yet church endures. It looks different maybe, but it endures. And this is Mark's gospel written to the early church. They had experienced Roman persecution, right? In the early first century, we had emperors that were persecuting Christ followers. And here you have the early church listening to Mark's gospel being read, and they could relate to this. They could relate to feeling as if the waves and the wind were going to overtake them as the church. Eugene Boring again says, it's important to acknowledge that this is a story that calls the church to a faith in the God who saves through and beyond death itself, not necessarily from death, right? And in that sense, we see that this is a story that acknowledges God's power, not just over wind and waves, but as we see the story continue with Mark's gospel, that Jesus demonstrates a power and authority that goes beyond death itself. And that God is one who saves through and beyond death, not from death. And in that sense, of course, the church will always endure. And after we read stories like this, that question we find later in Mark 8 continues to resurface when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" Verse 39, Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Third reflection is this: we see that Christ's power and authority is unmatched. Chapters 1 and 2 did a real powerful reflection and account of the power, the unmatched power and authority of Jesus. And in Mark 1, right, there's that unclean spirit that acknowledges, "I know who you are. What have you to do with me?" And in Mark 1, he rebukes the unclean spirit, and in Mark 4, Jesus rebukes the wind. He tells the wind to calm down. And in the Greek, that's the same words that are used. Although I think in Mark 4, there's actually a different used word for wind, but the narrative is important to consider here, that God is able to rebuke an unclean spirit, and just in the same way that he can exercise dominion and control over creation itself, right? The Mark is showing Jesus' sovereignty over creation. Earlier in Mark 4, Jesus has his parables are using things like plants and seeds, and this idea that in birds of the air, that God is one who has not just talks about the growth of creation, but can actually control creation itself by calming a storm. And Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" In verse 41, they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I think something for us to consider, fourth reflection, is this: I think we come to know Jesus better through the storms. I think we come to know him better through the storms. If you notice at the beginning of the story, the beginning of this account, when things really start to get scary, in verse 38, Jesus is asleep, right? And they say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And so they call him teacher, which is a term of respect and endearment. And yet at the same time, to call him teacher is to fall desperately short of understanding who he really is, right? He's not just a teacher. This is God with us. And so it begins with, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" And then at the end of it, there's this, "Who is this?" Right? And so they get to know who Jesus is better by breaking down their assumption that he's just a teacher, because they see him calm the storm. I think we come to know Jesus better through the storms. And finally, the final sort of reflection actually comes in chapter 5, where it says in verse 1, after the storm, they say, "Who is this that the wind and the sea obey him?" Chapter 5, it says, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes." So they set out when Jesus says, "Let's go to the other side." They hit the storm, because following Jesus is not absent of storms. Sometimes it feels like the storm is going to overtake the church, but we see that Christ's power and his authority is unmatched. They come to know Jesus better through the storm, and here they find themselves in a foreign land. So I think the fifth reflection is that perhaps after the storms, we find ourselves in a foreign land. We find ourselves somewhere different entirely. And I think as we are in this storm now as a church, we're in the storm of a global pandemic, of a pandemic that's exposing a lot of the brokenness of our global community. I think after this storm, we'll find ourselves in a foreign land. And the church will have endured, but it may look different, and that's okay. It's okay that it looks different, because the church endures, because Christ's power is unmatched. His authority is unmatched. Back to that Mary Poppins quote, "We're on the brink of an adventure. Don't spoil it with questions." I think I like that, in a sense that as hard as this storm is in our world right now, God is on the move. I really do believe that God is on the move, and I think it's good to ask questions. I think that's also good to have a mysterious sense of awe and unknowing in the midst of this. That we don't know what this foreign land may look like on the other side of the storm, and it's okay. We still trust that Jesus is with us in the midst of the storm. I keep coming back during this season. I keep coming back to the quote from Soren Kierkegaard that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And that we don't know why things are happening right now, and we don't know how God is going to redeem them. We don't know how God will restore them. We don't know what that foreign land may look like on the other side of this storm. But I do have hope, and I have trust that as we look back, we might see that, yeah, we got to know Jesus better through that storm. We look back and we see that, yeah, God is the God who can save through and beyond death itself, not necessarily from it. And we're in the middle of this storm, and we may not have these questions answered until we reach that other side. And that COVID-19 is exposing much of the brokenness in our world, and that's hard to sit with. But I think God is still with us. The storm doesn't mean that we're not on mission with Jesus, and in many ways it confirms it. The storm will not overtake the church. It will not overtake Christ's church, his body. I think we'll see Christ's unmatched power and authority continue to display itself as we move forward. I think the church may come to know Jesus better through this storm. Not just All Things New, but the broader global community of believers who call Jesus their King. I think we may come to know Jesus better through this storm. And I think when it's all over, we may find ourselves in a foreign land that looks new and different, and as we'll read next week, kind of scary. But God will be with us. And through all of it, we look to Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. So this week, may God be with us as we navigate this storm together. May we come to know him better as we grow closer to him and one another during this challenging time. And may, above all, we hear those powerful and authoritative words of Christ himself, where he says, "Peace, be still." Amen.